Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin, and today's video is about a great quilt pattern. It's Celestial Stripes by Zen Chic, and I have a lot to say about it. So it's been a hot minute since I have done a great quilt pattern video, and I guess it's because I've been making it up as I go along. my orange peel quilt is kind of a modification from another quilt pattern, and then I started in on my K-facet quilt and made that pattern up. So I haven't been using other people's patterns, interestingly, but I have a new project, and those of you that have been with me for a while are like, not another new project. But I have a friend who's having a baby boy, and I wanted a quilt pattern that was quick and easy and looks good and had somewhat modern sensibility about it. And let me tell you, Celestial Stripes is the way to go. Not to be confused with Celestial Seasonings, which is the tea company that has those crazy names like Lemon Zinger and Hummy Mint and Bengal Spice or whatever. Anyway, all those crazy. So it's Celestial Stripes by Brigitte Heitland, and her website and company name is Zen Chic, which, let me tell you, she had me at Zen Chic. Like, can you get two words that are more appealing than Zen and Chic? I'm not sure. But anyway, I have actually referenced this quilt pattern in a previous video. I did a fabric pull for binding strips that I had made. So 2.5-inch strips that I did an experiment to see how many of those strips I can get out of each size shirt. And once I did that, I had a bazillion 2.5-inch strips of fabric. And so I went on the hunt for a jelly roll friendly quilt pattern, and Celestial Stripes was one of the ones that rose to the top. I have a lot of things about, or I have a lot of thoughts and opinions, unsurprising, about this quilt pattern and why I think it's such a great quilt pattern. So starting from the top, it's easy. It's beginner friendly. There are no triangles. There's no flip and trim. You don't have to fold anything back and press it funny. You don't have to trim any pieces once things are sewn together. It is very straightforward, which is really great, even for those of us that have been quilting for a little while. Sometimes it's just nice to sew squares and rectangles together. I don't know about you guys, but I like to sit down at my sewing machine and get in the zone. I mean, it is a Zen thing. It's just like that chain piecing. Anyway, I digress. So it is a great pattern for beginners, and it comes together quickly, which is point number 2. So if you need to make a quilt quickly and you want something that has some style, but you don't want to spend a lot of time on it, this quilt pattern is for you. I made almost the whole quilt top in a morning. Now, that's not including cutting. Cutting takes a little while, but I mean, cutting always takes a little while. But the actual sewing part, you could conceivably have a whole quilt top in half a day or a day, which is remarkable in and of itself. Point number 3, C. We have a running joke that forever and ever, when I'm going to do like a bulleted point list, so like 1, 2, 3, I'll say point 1 and then B. So if I switch back and forth from numbers to letters, or if I lose my place entirely, just chalk it up to my general quirkiness. So point number 3 is, it is great, like Tony the Tiger. Great for men's shirts. And the reason is it doesn't use a lot of fabric, and the pieces are sized and shaped in such a way that you can get a lot of them out of just a single shirt. Now, I contend that not every quilt pattern is great for men's shirts. And the reason for that is the pieces that you get out of a shirt, obviously it is not like yardage. You're never going to have width of fabrics. You're never going to have a strip that's 42 to 44 inches long. You're never going to have a block that's bigger than 18 by 18. And that might even be a stretch unless you have a really large shirt back, and you might only get one. So if you have a quilt pattern that has large blocks or requires a long run of fabric, unless you're willing to piece it, which a lot of us are. And so if that's the case, then maybe this point doesn't matter to you. Not every quilt pattern is great for men's shirts. This one, the construction is such a way that you can get a lot of these pieces out of really any part of the shirt, including the sleeve, which is great because if you wanted to do either bigger, if you wanted to size up on the quilt, you could easily do it. For my purposes, I'm making a baby quilt, and I chose to use 8 pairs of fabrics, so 16 individual fabrics, and then doubled them. So the pattern calls for 32 different fabrics. I used 16 and then did 2 of each one. Most of them, I got what I needed out of a sleeve. So let that just encourage you. It is so great for shirts. In fact, when I got all the blocks made and was sitting down to do the arrangement, which I did on camera for the patrons in my Patreon community, they got to witness. It's just me trying to figure out how to put the blocks together in a way that there's good contrast. Anyway, I realized right as I sat down, oh, you know what? I only use shirts. And you might think, well, that's kind of your thing, Kathy, and it is my thing. But I very often use a combination. I'll use mostly shirts with a little bit of fat quarter kind of boost in there, or I'll use shirts and then I'll buy background fabric in bits and pieces. But this one, I just looked at, I was like, oh my goodness, I used all shirts. And it wasn't like, let me challenge myself by using all shirts. It just was, it was in the color palette, it worked, and I had plenty of fabric, and it just came that way. So if you had a doubt no more. So point number 3 might be the most important point, which is it just works beautifully with shirts. Point number 4 is there are a lot of variations that you can do with this quilt pattern. So both in the sizes, so the size quilts it will make, and also the arrangement of the block. I've got one on the table in front of me, which has been sitting here unaddressed for this whole time, but I'm going to get some blocks out and I want you to see what I'm talking about. So here are 2 of the blocks sewn together. So I did my pairs, so 16 fabrics, and I did a light with the light on the inside, dark on the outside, and then the reverse for every pair. So this block has a companion block that has the darker value on the outside and the lighter on the inside, and same for this one. You can see that the way I have put these 2 together, I'm going to call this a U, is with the U's facing out from each other. And I want to show you what happens when I put that together with other blocks. So here's another set. I have a companion set that is the whiter fabric on the outside and the gray, and vice versa here. You can see just that in and of itself is really pretty, but they can be put together this way, where it makes a bar in the center, or they can be put together this way, both horizontal or vertical. So if you wanted it to have that look instead of the kind of bar row look, more like columns. And then I'll show you an additional one. Here's where the two U's have been sewn together, facing each other. And so you can do bars apart, you can do bars together, or you can alternate them, and you can see how that would be very interesting, which is in fact the way I'm going to put this quilt top together. So every other block will face the opposite direction. So you'll have bars that way and then this bar together, if that makes sense. You can see I've actually already got this row pinned together. And so I've got these two facing apart, these two facing in. And that you can work that with a similar colors coming together, which is an interesting look, or you can do contrasting colors coming together, which is its own interesting look. So a lot of variation that you can do with this quilt pattern, both in the orientation of the rows versus columns, and then also within the block, or within the row and within the column. Another point about this quilt pattern, it's really a great quilt pattern. I mean, I say that about the great quilt patterns that I have featured on this channel. This one, though, it's kind of like the Quilty Stars that's behind me. There's something kind of magical about it. It just works so well for so many different things. So another thing about this quilt pattern that's so great, if I have not converted you into a men's shirt fabric user, it is fat quarter friendly and jelly roll friendly. So if you've come to me and you're looking for easy quilt patterns, this one it's so easy because you can use a jelly roll and you just choose your 32 fabrics from a collection if that's your cup of tea. Speaking of, and no, that's not Celestial Seasonings. If you haven't been converted, you can use jelly rolls in a collection. You can use fat quarters from a collection. You can mix and match shirts and fat quarters. So it is just built in good design with a good shape and good construction. You can see for yourself, it's not a complicated pattern. It's just designed really well. And the proportions are excellent. I do want to stop at this point. I always say this in my Great Quilt Pattern videos. Some of you can look at this, at the blocks, and hear me talk about this pattern and go, I know exactly how to make that, and I don't even have to buy that pattern. And I respect that. I respect the figuring it out. I respect the math. I respect the experienced quilters. But I do think it's very important that we support quilt pattern designers with our purchasing patterns. They do a lot of work to give us these great patterns. And so I always think it's a good idea, even if you can figure it out, you know, maybe show them a little love and buy the pattern so that they get the benefit of your gorgeous quilt. That's just a little preachy, but just I think it's important that all of us support each other in our creative efforts. Another thing about this pattern, now, with every quilt pattern, there are pros and cons, no matter what. And sometimes the pros and the cons are the same thing. And this is the case. This page of the quilt pattern, this is an actual, I bought it as a PDF and printed this one page. And this is the whole quilt pattern. So I have featured other great quilt patterns. There's a previous one I did that I think the actual number of pages of the quilt pattern is like 15, which is a lot. It feels overwhelming. This feels underwhelming. And I always read the pattern before I make it. It's kind of like reading a recipe before you get started. I read the whole thing and I was like, Wait, is that it? I mean, there are additional pages. The next page starts off with make the quilt sandwich. So if you're new to quilting, I want to revisit point number 1. It is so easy, but the actual printed directions or the PDF directions are not very elaborate or instructional. There's a little bit of a maybe you need to know what you're doing, but not really, because Brigitte Heitland, who is the designer behind Zen Chic, has a video where she shows how to actually sew the blocks together. In that video, which we will put a link in the description. Those of you that have heard me say this before, and you probably are like, you just, where the video is, there's a little description. You click more or read more or show more, and it will talk about the video, and then there will be links there, and you can click on it, and it will take you to either the book Sunday Morning Quilts or whatever. So in this case, it would be Brigitte's Celestial Stripes video tutorial. And in it, she shows how to construct the blocks, and then she shows different arrangements and orientations of the blocks so you can see for yourself kind of, what variations you can make. Point number, I don't know, I've forgotten, is one of the things that makes a great quilt pattern to me is when it works in any colorway. And I've talked about this quite a bit on the channel. Sometimes you see a quilt pattern and you go, that is gorgeous. And then you make it with your own fabrics and go, it just doesn't have that same magic. And it's because sometimes the quilt looking gorgeous is dependent on using the specific colorway that the designer had in mind. This one is not the case. It is, I've seen it in probably 20 or 30 different colorways. Bright, vibrant, muted, two-tone, shades of blue, and everyone is just as lovely. You can also make different sizes, which she does show in that same video. So I'm making the baby quilt size, which is just these blocks sewn together. If you want a throw size, you can put a border on it, which she has in the instructions. And then if you want a bed size, you can put another border on it. And there's this very interesting sashing that she uses. It's like a mini border around it that really enhances the focal point, which is these blocks put together. So definitely can size up. If you size up, it becomes more and more modern, in my opinion. Because of that, modern quilts a lot of times have a lot of that background space and a lot of negative space, and that is the case with this quilt pattern. So if you're making a quilt for someone who's a millennial or younger, it's a great quilt pattern because it does have that modern aesthetic, but it's not hard to make, and depending on what fabrics you use. So not to beat a dead horse, but to kind of circle back, the quilt pattern itself is excellent. The instructions are not very elaborate or detailed. So again, you could totally use her video tutorial to kind of fill in the gaps if you happen to be a beginner. If you're an experienced quilter, or if you have a skill level that has you up a little bit, you'll read it and be like, perfect, that's all I needed. And then the last kind of pro to me about this particular quilt pattern is she does in the beginning talk about cutting strips from width of fabric, but she gives you the dimensions of the pieces and the block, which if you're going to be working with shirts, that is where you have to start. A lot of people start with, well, okay, I cut this many strips from width of fabric, but we don't have width of fabric when you have shirts. And so sometimes you have to dig through a quilt pattern to find out what is the size of the block, what is the shape of this piece, and then work backwards. That is in the very first line of the instructions. So super helpful for those of us that are using shirts, or if you're doing this from a scrappy standpoint, makes it a lot easier. There aren't a lot of cons, honestly, with this quilt pattern. If you don't just love a modern look, this may not be the quilt pattern for you. But I will say I used all these shirts, and they're in a somewhat muted color palette, and it doesn't feel quite as modern. It feels very bridge the gap between modern and traditional, to me at least. It depends on really what fabrics you choose, but it does lean a little more modern, which is what Zen Chic, which is what Brigitte does with her designs. So if you're making a quilt for a younger person, or if you are younger and you don't just love the old traditional quilt styles, this one might be a great one for you. So that's a lot of praise for this quilt pattern. Definitely great in the great quilt pattern. I will have this probably on my design wall in an upcoming video, because I really almost have the whole quilt top put together, since it comes together so quickly. So there are tons and tons of images out there. If you type in Celestial Stripes by Zen Chic in Google, you will get immediately a whole set of inspirational ideas. If you're on Instagram, hashtag Celestial Stripes Quilt gives you also lots of inspiration. But let me encourage you, especially if you're really getting into the men's shirts, and especially if you're a beginner, this is a great one. I hope this has been helpful for you and gives you an idea of a great quilt pattern for your future quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thanks so much for watching.